The first time General Kael and Commander Soren Elric met, it was on the battlefield. The wind carried the scent of iron and fire, the sky bruised with the smoke of burning cities. Soldiers screamed, steel met steel, and in the chaos, two men found each other, one clad in the black and silver of the Solmiran Empire, the other draped in the crimson banners of the Rhenvian rebellion. Kael was a man of discipline, his blade an extension of his will. Every movement precise, every strike calculated. His loyalty to the Empire was absolute, his victories numerous, his name whispered with both reverence and fear. Soren was reckless where Kael was methodical, unchained where Kael was bound. His sword danced, not fought, weaving between enemies with devastating grace. He was the flame of Rhenvia, the leader who had refused to kneel when his kingdom crumbled. They should have been nothing more than enemies, one meant to fall by the other's hand. And yet, every time their swords clashed, they hesitated. A heartbeat too long. A breath too sharp. Kael's blade would pause at Soren's throat, and in those fleeting seconds, something burned between them, something neither of them could name. Then the moment would shatter, and they would part, each retreating into the war that demanded their hatred. But fate is a cruel thing. And war has a way of forcing men into each other's arms, even as it tries to tear them apart. The night Kael was captured, the world whispered of his downfall. Dragged in chains through the halls of the Rhenvian stronghold, he was a shadow of the fearsome general he had once been. His black armor was cracked, his face bloodied, his wrists bound with iron. Outside, the rebels roared for his execution. Inside, Soren Elric stood before him, silent. The years had changed them both. Soren had hardened, the wildness in his eyes tempered by loss. He did not smile when he saw Kael, did not mock or revel in his enemy's defeat. He only looked at him, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. "They want me to break you," Soren said at last, his voice like steel wrapped in silk. "To take whatever secrets you carry before they burn you at the stake." Kael, though bruised, smirked. "Then get on with it." But the interrogation never came. Instead, Soren brought water. Cleaned Kael's wounds. Came back the next night. And the next. At first, they spoke in venom. Soren called him a murderer. Kael called him a traitor. Their words were knives, meant to cut, but somehow they only drew them closer. Then, one night, the storm outside raged too loudly, and in the dim candlelight of the dungeon, the anger broke into something else. "Why did you spare me?" Kael asked, voice low. Soren didn't answer right away. He exhaled slowly, his fingers curling over the edge of the table between them. "You know why." Kael's breath caught. He should have turned away. He should have fought against the pull tightening between them. But when Soren stepped closer, when his fingers brushed Kael's jaw, a touch so impossibly soft it burned, Kael did not pull away. And when Soren kissed him, slow and devastating, Kael knew that this was not surrender. This was war of another kind. Kael escaped. Soren let him. It was madness, and it did not go unnoticed. The Empire whispered of Kael's failure. The rebellion whispered of Soren's weakness. And yet, neither could stop what had begun between them. Under the cover of night, Kael slipped past enemy lines, his black cloak blending with the shadows. He found Soren waiting, standing at the ruins of an old temple where once, before war, Rhenvia's gods had been worshipped. "We should end this," Soren murmured, his breath warm against the cool night air. Kael pressed him against the stone pillars, hands gripping the fabric of his crimson coat. "Then do it." Soren's fingers curled in Kael's hair, his lips a breath away. "You first." They kissed like men who knew it could be their last. Fingertips traced battle scars. Mouth spoke silent vows. They were not lovers. They were not enemies. They were something else, something the world would never understand. When the Empire discovered Kael's betrayal, he was given a choice: redeem himself by bringing them Soren Elric's head, or die a traitor's death. And when the rebellion discovered Soren's secret meetings with the enemy general, they, too, made their decision. Soren was captured. Sentenced to death. Kael stormed the rebel stronghold alone. Cut down anyone who stood in his path. When he reached the execution site, he found Soren bound at the pyre, flames licking at his feet. And for the first time in his life, Kael, the Empire's most loyal general, fell to his knees before an enemy. "Soren," he whispered, voice breaking. "Please." Soren looked down at him, and though his body was bruised and broken, his eyes still burned. "You were never meant to kneel," he murmured. Then, as the flames roared higher, Kael did the unthinkable. He turned his sword against his own men. Slaughtered them all. Untied Soren's bindings with shaking hands. And as the rebellion's leader collapsed into his arms, coughing, gasping for air, Kael pressed his forehead to Soren's and whispered the words that had been buried between them for too long. "I would burn the world for you." A love born in war does not find peace so easily. They ran, but the past ran faster. Kael and Soren moved from village to village, never staying long. The remnants of the Solmiran Empire wanted Kael's head. The broken factions of the rebellion wanted Soren's. Their love had freed them from war, but it had not freed them from its ghosts. One evening, as they camped in the ruins of an old Rhenvian monastery, Kael sat sharpening his dagger, the firelight casting gold along his jaw. Soren, lying back against a fallen column, watched him through half-lidded eyes. "You're brooding again," Soren murmured, a teasing lilt in his voice. Kael didn't look up. "You talk too much." Soren smirked, pushing himself upright. He crawled forward, settling behind Kael, and rested his chin on his shoulder. His arms wrapped around Kael's waist, his breath warm against Kael's neck. "You never used to hesitate in battle." Kael stiffened slightly. "What are you implying?" Soren's fingers traced light patterns over Kael's hands, rough from years of wielding swords. "I'm saying," he murmured, "you never used to think twice before killing a man. And yet, when we were escaping that last village, you spared the imperial officer who recognized you." Kael exhaled through his nose. He was young. Barely more than a boy. Soren's grip tightened. "You're changing." Kael set the dagger down, turning slightly so he could meet Soren's gaze. The fire flickered between them, reflected in Soren's dark eyes. "Isn't that why you loved me?" Kael asked, voice quieter than the wind. "Because I wasn't just a sword." Soren swallowed, his fingers ghosting over Kael's scarred knuckles. "I never loved you because of what you were. I love you despite it." Kael's heart stilled. The words were simple. Soft. Yet they struck harder than any wound he had ever taken. Slowly, as if testing the fragility of the moment, he reached up and cupped the side of Soren's face. Soren leaned into his touch without hesitation. For the first time in years, Kael closed his eyes and allowed himself to believe in something other than war. Peace was an illusion. Months passed, and whispers of their survival spread. The empire was crumbling. The rebellion had splintered. And in the void left behind, an offer came. A letter, carried by an imperial messenger who knelt before Kael in the middle of a nameless town square. Kael Verith. The empire does not forget its fallen sons. Return, and you shall be granted pardon. Your past erased. Your name restored. Kael read it twice, his hand steady. Soren sat across from him at the worn tavern table, his expression unreadable. "It's a trap," Soren said. Kael smirked. "Of course it is." Soren set his tankard down with a sharp clank. "You're thinking about it." Kael met his gaze. "No," he said. "I'm thinking about you." Soren's fingers curled against the wood. "If you go back, they'll use you. You know that." "I do." Silence stretched between them. A storm without thunder. Soren let out a slow breath, his eyes narrowing. "But Kael ran a hand through his hair, jaw tight. But we can't keep running forever. Soren flinched, as if struck. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of too many battles, too many sacrifices, hung between them. Then, Soren laughed. A quiet, bitter sound. Tell me, he said, leaning forward. If I had been the one offered a chance to rebuild Rhenvia, to bring my people back from the ashes, would you let me go? Kael stared at him. No. Soren's lips quirked in something almost like a smile. Then don't ask me to let you. Kael exhaled sharply, raking a hand over his face. The truth of it was simple. If he went back, he would become a pawn once more. If he refused, the Empire would never stop hunting them. No choices left. No roads unbroken. But then, Soren reached across the table. Slid his hand into Kael's. We'll find another way, he said. We always do. Kael looked down at their intertwined fingers, calloused and scarred, battle-worn and weary. And for the first time in years, he let himself believe. Years passed it, the world forgot them. The war faded into legend. The empire fractured. The rebellion dissolved. New leaders rose, and the old warlords were buried beneath history's dust. And somewhere, hidden among the ruins of a once great kingdom, a quiet life took root. A small village, untouched by politics. A modest home, nestled at the edge of a golden field. A man who once wielded a sword now tending to a garden. Another who once commanded armies now teaching children how to read. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Kael stood on the hill overlooking their home. The wind carried the scent of earth and pine, the only sound the distant laughter of villagers finishing their day's work. Soren approached from behind, silent as always. He had never lost the habit of moving like a shadow. You're staring again, Soren teased, nudging Kael's shoulder. Getting sentimental in your old age? Kael rolled his eyes. I'm not old. Soren smirked. Tell that to the gray in your hair. Kael turned sharply, reaching for Soren's wrist, but Soren only laughed, dodging with practiced ease. It turned into a game, a chase down the hillside, their movements still fluid, still sharp, as if their bodies remembered the rhythm of war. Except this was different. There was no killing stroke. No battlefield. Only the chase. The laughter. The breathless collision as Kael caught Soren at last, pulling him close, arms locking around his waist. Soren's breath hitched, laughter fading as Kael leaned in. And then, softly, reverently, Kael kissed him. No desperation. No war. Just love, simple and unburdened. And in that moment, standing under a sky that no longer belonged to kings and generals, Kael finally understood. They had spent their lives fighting to survive. But this was what it meant to live. It began with whispers. A traveling merchant passed through the village, speaking of an imperial remnant rallying under a new banner, led by a mysterious warlord claiming the right to unite the land once more. At first, Kael dismissed the rumors as idle talk. The empire was fractured, its generals scattered. How could it rise again? But the merchant's words lingered, and as Kael looked over the fields at dusk, he sensed a familiar tension in the air, like the charge before a storm. Soren noticed the worry etched into Kael's brow. One evening, as they shared a simple meal by candlelight, Soren set down his cup and reached for Kael's hand. Are you afraid? He asked softly. Kael's gaze flicked to the window, where the night pressed in. I don't know if I'm afraid, he said, voice low. I only know that I can't let war find us again. Soren's golden eyes flashed. Then we won't let it. They clasped hands, an unspoken vow passing between them. Days turned to weeks. The rumors grew louder, carried by wanderers and refugees fleeing skirmishes in the borderlands. A name kept surfacing, Raviel Arcturus, a former imperial officer who claimed to wield authority over the scattered legion. One afternoon, Kael returned from the village market to find Soren standing outside their cottage, a letter in his hand. It bore the broken seal of the Empire, a crest Kael thought he would never see again. It was delivered by a messenger, Soren said quietly. Kael took the parchment, his heart pounding. The letter spoke of reconciliation. Of restoring the Empire to its rightful glory. Of seeking out loyal sons who had once served under its banner. At the bottom, in bold strokes, was Rhenvia's signature. The fire in Kael's chest rose. How dare they summon him, after all the bloodshed, all the betrayals? Soren caught the tremor in Kael's hands, stepping close, his own voice a gentle anchor. They want to draw you in, he murmured. Don't let them. Kael closed his eyes, inhaling Soren's steady presence. We swore we'd never fight another war, he whispered. But even as he spoke, Kael knew that the choice might be taken from them. When word came that Rhenvia's forces had been spotted near the old Rhenvian border, tension rippled through the village. Farmers hid their harvest, blacksmiths forged weapons in secret. The quiet countryside braced itself for the possibility of violence. One night, as thunder rolled in the distance, Kael and Soren sat by the single candle in their cottage. Rain battered the shutters, and each rumble of thunder felt like an echo of the battles they had left behind. Soren lifted his gaze, meeting Kael's eyes across the dim room. If they come for us, we'll stand together. Kael's voice was hoarse. We promised we wouldn't fight again. Soren's lips curved into a sad smile. We promised we wouldn't start another war. But we can't let them destroy our home. Slowly, Kael reached out, threading his fingers through Soren's. Their hands joined, a silent pledge of unity. In that moment it was clear, if war returned to their doorstep, they would not run. They would stand side by side, as they always had, bound by a love that had survived the worst of humanity. Dawn broke over the fields, painting the sky in pale pink and gold. Outside, the village stirred to life, bracing for the unknown. Inside the cottage, Kael and Soren prepared themselves. Not in armor, for they were no longer the warriors of old, but in quiet determination. They had chosen peace. Now, they would fight, only if forced, to protect it. Kael stood at the door, turning back to Soren, who still lingered by the hearth. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the memories of war flashed between them, swords, blood, tears, and kisses stolen in the darkness. But above all, they remembered the promise that bound them. Soren crossed the small distance between them, pressing his forehead gently to Kael's. We face this together, he whispered. Kael nodded, heart steady. Always. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of marching feet, Rhenvia's forces drawing near, or perhaps just another rumor. Regardless, Kael and Soren stepped into the morning light, side by side, ready for whatever the new dawn would bring. Their story was far from over. But one truth remained unshakable: love had carried them beyond war before. And it would carry them again.